several people online today for this call who are part of the Colorado Parent is it called Vaccination Coalition?
We're Colorado Parents for Vaccinated Communities.
Yes, communities. Thank you. And I would like to welcome you all to our meeting today. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Are you guys ready for us to get started then?
Yeah. And I just want to let you guys know, unless you want us to ask questions in between, if you guys will all please mute your computers so that we can all hear what they're talking about.
Okay, so my name is Angie Anderson, and I'm here today with Dr. Amy Bernard and Dr. Stephanie James. And as you said, we all know each other through an organization called Colorado Parents for Vaccinated Communities. We're also all involved in some way or another with Immunize Colorado. And both organizations have similar missions, but different outreach. So Immunize Colorado, these bullet points actually I pulled straight from their website. So they're working to keep the community protected from preventable disease through strengthening public health policy, coalition building, community outreach, provider education, data translation, and free and low cost immunization partnerships. It's a really amazing organization. They get all their funding independently from pharmaceutical companies. So that's something they pride themselves on, but they work with many different partners in the communities. They work with refugee community. They work on vaccine equity. So an amazing organization, an amazing mission. Colorado Parents for Vaccinated Communities is the organization that I work mostly with and I'm most familiar with. It was started by a woman named Sundari Kraft back in 2013. And basically her whole vision for the organization was to really amplify parent voices in the legislative and public health policy process. So if you're familiar at all with the anti-vaccine movement, they're very vocal and they have a lot of moms and a lot of parents. And what we bring to the table is the pro-vaccine parent side of things. And that's because legislators and policymakers listen to parents. So, you know, of course, experts are important and essential, and we need their expertise and we need the science and we need the medicine. But as constituents, parents matter. So that's where we come from. And a little history of Colorado Parents for Vaccinated Communities and what we've been doing over the years. In 2015, some legislation in Colorado was passed called, referred to as Vaccinate for Healthy Schools. And the main thing that came from that was greater data transparency. So schools have to publish their vaccination rates. So I can go online as a parent and I can look at local preschools, public schools, private schools, and look at, you know, compare vaccination rates and decide if I want to send my kids somewhere, you know, based on their vaccination rates. So that was really important. And then just this year in 2020, Senate Bill 163 was passed, and that tightens up the Colorado vaccination exemption process. So if you're familiar at all, which you may or may not be, but Ruth did mention at the beginning that we have very low vaccination rates in Colorado. And one of the reasons for that is because we allow parents to exempt their children from childhood vaccinations for pretty much any reason, medical, non-medical. Of course, everyone should be entitled to a medical exemption if they need it, but personal belief or religious or whatever, anything allowed in Colorado. And it used to be that you could take your child you know, to register them for school and just write a quick note at the office, and that was considered an exemption. But now with the passing of this legislation, parents are going to have a conversation with an immunizing provider like a doctor, a nurse practitioner, and get an exemption form signed by that provider, or watch an online video module. So that was a huge victory for us in Colorado, because it's gonna just make it that much more difficult, if you will, to get a vaccination exemption in order to send your child to school. So you can't just, you know, be behind on your kids' exemptions, write a note, submit it, and start school and kind of let it slide. You've got to be very serious about getting that vaccine exemption. So we have a website, we're on social platforms, we have a town hall program and advocacy, but that's what we do. And I was very, very, very fortunate through that organization to meet these two amazing presenters today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce you by reading some highlights of their bio. They are both so well qualified. I could spend the whole time talking about them, but Dr. Amy Bernard has a broad background in cellular immunology and molecular biology with specific expertise in human immunology. Having obtained her doctorate in the developmental regulation of human B cells and the autoimmune disorder systemic lupus erythematosus. Did I get that right, Amy? Erythematosus? I don't know. Anyway, she's the Assistant Director for CU School of Medicine, Dean's Office, Human Immunology and Immunotherapy Initiative. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Immunology and Microbiology. So she teaches immunology within the graduate school, medical school, dental school, child health advocate and physician assistant program at the Anschutz Medical Campus. Most recently, she developed and taught a COVID-19 clinical disease focused course to second, third, and fourth year medical students during the pandemic. So she's going to start us off, and then Dr. Stephanie James will follow up. And Dr. James earned her undergraduate degree in biology from Gonzaga University, her MS in biology from Eastern Washington University. She has an MBA from the City University of Seattle. She spent several years in the biotech industry and then returned to school at the University of Northern Colorado to earn her doctoral degree in biological education. She studied both education and zoonotic viruses. She did her dissertation on the effects of TGF on hantavirus cardiopulmonary disease. She also did a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Neurology at the University of Colorado, and her research investigated immune responses to varicella-zoster virus reactivation, which is what causes shingles. So now she's an associate professor of pharmaceutical science within the School of Pharmacy at Regis University. So both, like I said, have extensive lists of qualifications, but I'm going to stop there because I think that's enough to give you an idea of how well qualified they are to talk to us about this today. One more thing I'm going to leave you with before they get started. Amy, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the Coronavirus Prevention Network website, this is just a really good resource if you're interested in learning more about the ongoing trials. It's a partnership. It was started by the NIAID. And we all know who Dr. Fauci is. Dr. Fauci is the head of the NIAID in the National Institutes of Health. So it's actually a really interesting website. It's a fun way to poke around. If anyone happens to be interested in volunteering for clinical trials, this is how I got involved. I'm in the Pfizer vaccine trial. I signed up through this website. They contacted me. I answered some questions and we went from there. So it's also got some information on just the really layperson overviews of how vaccines and antibodies work and little videos and articles. So I would encourage you to go look at that. It's coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org. But without any further ado, I'm going to pass it off.
All right, thanks for having us here. So I'm Amy Bernard, and like Angie mentioned, I'm an immunologist at the Anschutz Medical Campus. And today, Dr. James and I are going to talk about a variety of topics under the context of vaccines and this SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes the disease COVID-19. So first, I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what vaccines are and how they work with the immune system to provide protective and lasting immunity. We'll We'll talk to you a little bit about some of the types of vaccines that are under development. There are, I think, close to 80 vaccines under development right now, a couple of different formulations. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to pass it off to Dr. James. She's going to talk about the phases of the vaccine testing process and a little bit about vaccine distribution plan for Colorado. If you have questions, I think it probably would be best to type them in the chat. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. But I think we are going to have to probably streamline our talking to make sure we get everything in that we want to discuss with you before the end of your meeting. But make sure to keep those questions because we'd be happy to answer questions. Also, you can always email us afterwards if you have questions that you think about later, and we'll show you our email on the last slide. So vaccines, it's important to understand that vaccines work with your own immune system. So they work with the cells of our body that help to protect us against pathogens like viruses. So they're going to provide long-lasting protection. And a vaccine is an immunotherapeutic, which is just a medicine that uses the immune system that is a non-harmful form of a pathogen that stimulates your immune system to start fighting the pathogen. So the viral components within vaccines will allow the cells of your immune system to train ahead of the real pathogen entering your body and to build an army of cells that are going to remember that pathogen. So immune cells in our body, there are certain cells called B cells and T cells. They are actually capable of making memory cells that live in our body for years and years. And when those memory cells see the real infectious, harmful pathogen, they will, since they've been trained, they will attack that pathogen immediately upon entry of the body. So the ultimate goal of a vaccine is to provide long-lasting protection and memory cells that would eliminate or control an infectious virus when it enters your body. So I'm going to show you, this is a schematic from the journal called Nature, is a very prestigious journal in science and medicine. This is a little bit busy of a slide, but it gives us a really nice overview of how vaccines work and how we stimulate an immune response. So I thought I would walk through this diagram with you to explain what is going on in our bodies when a virus infects us and how the immune system works to protect us against pathogens like a virus, and then also to create memory so that our body will remember and fight that pathogen much more quickly. So if we look at the left side of this diagram, you can see this is the coronavirus. You'll notice that the outer membrane, kind of like the outer coat of the virus, has these spike proteins on the surface. So that's what your immune system will see, is the outside of the virus. Just like people see the clothes you wear, your immune cells are going to see the spike protein that the virus is wearing on its external membrane. So the virus gets into our cells by using these proteins on its outer coat to bind to proteins on on cells of the human body. And if you guys have done a little bit of reading about coronavirus, there's this, it's called an ACE2 receptor. That's the particular protein on our respiratory cells that coronavirus uses to get in. So the spike protein actually binds to that protein, that receptor, on our respiratory cells, and that's the ticket to get in. That's kind of the key that unlocks the opening of the cell. So once the virus enters the cell, viruses actually take over the cells of our body. You can think of it as, like, I tell my students, it's like cell jacking. just like someone who steals a car, when they take over the car and they use everything and they turn that car into their own. When a virus takes over a cell, it uses everything inside that cell to make more virus. So it takes over your body's cells with the ultimate goal of making a lot more virus. So what we see here is this virus, it enters the human cell. It's now going to start to release its genetic material. In the case of the coronavirus, that's RNA. RNA is something that our cells also use, but our genetic instructions are called DNA. So it's a little bit different of a nucleic acid, but RNA is something that our body cells use to make RNA. So this virus just happens to have RNA as its genetic instructions, and it takes over the cell's machinery for this RNA to be made into proteins that allow for the assembly of more viruses. So again, the ultimate goal of the virus is to take over the cell and make a lot more virus that will then be released from the cell to then enter more respiratory cells. And this schematic is oversimplified because you see one virus going in and we only see one virus leaving. This is not the case. When a virus takes over a cell, it typically makes hundreds to thousands of viruses that it then releases from the cell that then take over nearby cells, because you have all the respiratory cells in your body. So the virus is going to continue to take over the cells in your respiratory tract, like your lungs. So this is what on the left side is what the virus does. Now on the right side is how our immune system is going to defend us against viral attack. So what we can see here, this cell kind of looks like a little bit like an octopus. This is a particular type of immune cell called an antigen presenting cell. And these cells are very important because what they do is they actually take in or ingest, kind of like eat, virus. And this antigen presenting cell has eaten up the virus. It actually breaks it up into small pieces, so it degrades it. And then it puts those pieces on the outer surface of its cellular membrane to alert other immune cells in our body. So it like rips the virus into pieces and actually puts pieces of the virus on its outer membrane. These little pieces of virus, peptide is just a short piece of protein. These pieces of the virus that are being displayed by this antigen presenting immune cell are going to help to alert another type of cell in our body called a T helper cell. And this immune cell is incredibly important because just like what its name suggests, it helps other cells of the immune system become stimulated and alerted and start to help train the immune system against this virus. So this T helper cell, now that it's been alerted of the pathogen that has broken into the body, it's now going to alert other cell types. So I'm just going to tell you about two more types of important cells in the immune system. There are B cells. This cell happens to be my favorite cell. B cells make antibody. You've probably heard a lot about these proteins, these antibodies that are secreted by B cells. These are just proteins that will help to kind of stick around viruses. You can see that they're kind of latching onto, attaching to the virus, and that's going to allow removal or elimination of this virus from the body. And it also stops it from working because it's being surrounded by antibodies. So B cells are very important because they make those antibody proteins. Another important cell type that the T helper cell will activate are cytotoxic T cells. And probably the more common term for that type of T cell is what's called a killer T cell. And the reason why is because those killer T cells, that's exactly what they do. They kill infected cells. So what you can see down here is this is a cell of the body that's been infected with the virus. And this T cell, this killer T cell, knows that it's infected and it actually kills it to remove that virally infected cell. Now, what's really important about these types of cells, the B cell, the T helper cell, and the killer T cell, these are the only cells in our body that can make memory. So anytime we are infected with a pathogen or we get a vaccine, these cells that respond will provide memory. And memory cells can live for months or even years in our body, and they continually patrol our body. And when the real infectious agent comes back, those memory cells are going to immediately respond. And sometimes they respond so quickly that we don't even know that we're sick. We don't even know that we've been infected. So that is the basis of vaccination. We want to make memory so that the next time we come into contact with the pathogen, our immune system has already been trained and will go and take care of the infection before we become sick. Or maybe we get a little bit sick, but we would get even more sick, more severely sick if we didn't have memory. So it either controls the infection completely or prevents us from having serious illness. So now that you guys know everything you need to know about how the immune system works, by the way, that crash course, I think Dr. James would agree, we would teach that in like an entire semester. So there you have it in like a 5-minute overview. We're going to move on to telling you a little bit about some of the vaccines that are being developed. And there are several different formulations. The reason being is we don't know as scientists which of these are going to be the best. So right now we have a variety of companies and academic institutions that are working on all these different formulations of vaccines. And through research and clinical trials, we're going to figure out which of these formulations work the best. So this is a schematic. This comes from that same Nature article of different types of vaccines that are in development against SARS-CoV-2, which again is the virus that causes COVID-19. So I am going to walk you through each of these different types of vaccine formulations. So let's move first to the virus vaccines. There are two major forms of virus vaccines. What you can see here on the right for the schematic or the drawing, the weakened virus vaccines, it's just what they sound like. These are where you take the virus and you weaken it to the point that it's no longer infectious. So it's no longer capable of causing harm. So it wouldn't cause disease. So several companies are working on a weakened or attenuated version of the virus to use that as a vaccine. One thing that is nice about this type of vaccine is that the virus is actually still alive. Again, it's not harmful, it's not going to cause disease, but it can replicate, which means that the immune system will have more virus to work with. So the more virus the immune system can work with, often the better it is at protecting us down the road. Another form is this inactivated. This is where scientists will often treat the virus with either heat or certain chemicals that will essentially kill the virus. So it will prevent it from being able to cause disease. But what's important is it still has to look like the real virus, because remember, that's how the immune system sees the virus. It needs to look at the outside, what the virus is wearing on its outer coat. So it has to look good enough that the immune system will still respond to it. But we know that there are several companies that are working on these types of virus vaccines. other types of vaccines that are currently in development. And you can see here, there are at least 20 groups that are working on these types of vaccines. These are called viral vector vaccines. These are just a little bit more complicated, but essentially what these are is where scientists work with a weakened version of a different vaccine. Or sorry, of a weakened version of a different virus. The most common vector that they would use is another virus that causes the common cold called adenovirus. And scientists are really kind of resourceful here. They actually remove all of the harmful genes from that weakened adenovirus, and they put back in one thing, and that's a target gene for the virus that they're trying to protect us against. So as an example, if you look at this picture down here on the bottom left, they have taken out the harmful genes, but added in the coronavirus spike gene, so that when your body takes in this form of the vaccine, your own cells of your body will make the spike protein. Remember, that's the outer surface of the virus. So now your immune system will be trained against that spike protein. And then there are non-replicating viral vectors, pretty much the same technology. The only difference is just what it sounds like. This form will not replicate in your body, whereas this replicating viral vector would. Again, the only difference is that you would have a little bit more material to work with if it replicates. Okay, the last version I'm going to tell you about before I hand it off to Dr. James is the protein-based vaccines. And this is just what it sounds like. It's where they actually take proteins that are synthetically created from the virus and put those directly into your body through the vaccine. And there are over 25 groups that are working on these types of vaccines. What you can see here in this picture is what you can see here in this picture is they've taken spike protein. So it's isolated spike protein. Remember, that's the outer coat of the virus. And they're just injecting the spike protein. So there's absolutely no way that you can get sick or have an infection from this, because it's just the outer pieces of the vaccine, or sorry, of the virus. One thing that's important to keep in mind, while this does work, we require things called adjuvants, just because this doesn't stimulate a fabulous immune response. It's kind of moderate. So you have to add in things that would enhance the immune response. So there are certain things we use that we know will help the immune system respond very vigorously. So we have to use these bits of protein with adjuvants. And then often we find we need multiple doses of this type of vaccine. It still works very well, but we just often have to use those adjuvants in multiple doses. And then the virus-like particles, this is kind of fancy. The scientists will actually recreate the outer shell of the virus. So this is an empty viral shell. So they're called viral-like particles, or virus-like particles, or VLPs. And this has the spike protein in the membrane, but there's absolutely nothing inside. So you couldn't get infected from this. This would just be used to stimulate the immune system against that outer coat that you see on the virus. Now, these have been shown to be pretty effective, but they're actually really hard to make. So that's one of the downsides of that type of vaccine. So I am now going to shift it over to Dr. James, and she's going to tell you about probably the most exciting formulation right now, because these are the vaccines that have come to Colorado and across the globe, and they're being used right now. So Dr. James, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you everyone for inviting us here and having us, give this talk today. I gave a talk at the Westminster 710 Rotary a few years ago, and it was just such an enjoyable group of people. And thank you for all the work that I know you guys are all doing for the community. So like Dr. Bernard said, I'm going to talk to you about the nucleic acid vaccines that are, Pfizer's was just recently given emergency use approval. And I think then Moderna's will be following shortly. So again, a lot of teams are working on nucleic acid vaccines. And so I'm sure that you've heard of RNA vaccines, but I just want to take this opportunity to describe them and how they're being used to fight COVID. So this is just a general overview of nucleic acid vaccines. And so in the use of this type of a vaccine, a part of the viral protein of interest is inserted into human cells. And then, like Dr. Bernard mentioned, the human cells will make proteins using this nucleic acid material, and they'll produce the viral protein. In the case of COVID, they're using that viral spike protein. So what you can see here, there are two different nucleic acids they can choose to use. One would be DNA. And so you see that they take the piece of RNA that would code for the coronavirus spike protein and turn it into DNA. And then they would provide that in some type of a injection to get into your cells. Usually this would be through a process called electroporation. We see this use of DNA vaccines actually more in plants than we do in humans or animals. The other type of vaccine that I think you're probably more familiar with because it's been in the news is the RNA vaccine. And so in this case, they take a piece of RNA and they basically encapsulate it into fat droplets. And then this is injected into the muscle cells of the upper arm. This RNA then goes inside of the cells where it will code for viral proteins. These are secreted, and then that will trigger the immune response that Dr. Bernard discussed earlier. So if you can advance the slide. So I want to back up just a little bit. You might be asking yourself, isn't this dangerous? Injecting, nucleic acid into a person, how does this work? And so I want to discuss a little bit about why these vaccines are safe and effective. So in our cells, most of us know that DNA is housed in a special compartment called the nucleus. And what enters and exits the nucleus of each cell is very tightly controlled. We know that the DNA is the quote unquote instruction manual for everything that makes us up. But how does it go from DNA to protein? And that's always been what we call the central dogma of biology. So RNA actually acts as an intermediate in this sense. The RNA is made using DNA as a template. This RNA will then leave that nucleus and go to what's called a ribosome and direct the building of proteins. And again, this process is tightly regulated. And so once that RNA is out of the nucleus, it cannot go back into the nucleus where the DNA is housed. And actually, after the RNA directs how those proteins are to be made, it's degraded by the cell. So what the RNA vaccines can do is they can sort of skip over that DNA to RNA part and just manufacture the RNA. And then that RNA is then injected into an individual in the case of a vaccine. And this piece of viral protein is what will be secreted and described and recognized by your immune system to help develop that immunity. So in the mRNA vaccines for COVID, a small piece of RNA is isolated from the virus. And this is actually the part that codes for that spike protein that Dr. Bernard mentioned, binds to the ACE receptor on the cells of our lungs. And so one of the reasons that this is chosen is because research has shown that if we could block that from happening, then that's an effective way to help control disease pathology in an infected individual. So what happens is the RNA is encased in this lipid coat. It's injected through a vaccine similar to other vaccines like a flu shot, and that administration just in the upper arm. goes into your cells. Your cells will make the spike protein. That spike protein will be secreted from the cell, and then your immune system recognizes it to mount a memory immune response. It's important to, I also just want to mention here that with these RNA vaccines, they're very safe and easy to develop, as it only involves making the genetic material. So these can actually be made quite rapidly in the lab and in manufacturing plants. So I see there's a question, can a vaccinated person still transmit the virus? That's a great question. Right now, unfortunately, the answer is we don't know. That is something that Pfizer is studying, where they are looking at individuals that have been vaccinated. Can they become infected with the virus and then transmit it to someone else? Or does the vaccine prevent the infection to a point where they are not contagious to be able to transmit it to someone else? Right now, we just know that the vaccines prevent disease in vaccinated individuals. So go to the next slide. So, so with the vaccines, I kind of put this up because, you know, one of the big questions is everyone now is ready for this vaccine. And it's really been, you know, just remarkable how quickly they have come out. And I do want to mention that, you know, these have come out and I really don't believe that they have come out with any compromise in safety. And I know that's a big concern with a lot of individuals. And so I just want to say, you know, one of the things we want to question is how do we know that they are safe? It's a process that can't be rushed and really requires a careful review of all of the data. So really quick, if you are interested in where these vaccine trials, there were some trials at Anschutz. There were some associated with the Aurora Center of the Medical Center of Aurora, and you could go to that COVID prevention network, and they, I think, will also list where the other sites are for vaccine testing clinical trials. So there is this really rigid testing process when it comes to the development of any drug, including vaccines. And so this first consists of a preclinical test. And really, scientists have been studying RNA vaccines for a long time before the COVID pandemic hit. And so this wasn't a new technology. It was just something that hadn't been put into use yet for human vaccination. And so scientists also knew a lot about coronaviruses in general from the SARS outbreak of 2003 in China, as well as a MERS outbreak. So these coronaviruses, although this particular strain is new, there were a lot of scientists that were already studying coronaviruses and RNA vaccines. And this was all in preclinical research in which scientists are testing new vaccines. We call it in vitro. So it's on cells in the lab. It doesn't require any animal model. After that shows promising data in vitro, then they'll move to an animal model. They typically start with mice, and they'll move that up to primates, which are the closest relative of humans. After they finish all this preclinical testing, the scientists will, or the company will apply for what's called an investigational new drug. And this is an application to the FDA. The FDA will review this, look at all the preclinical data, and then either grant them permission to continue with a phase 1 safety trial or deny it. And the scientists and the company has to go back to square one. So in the phase 1 safety trials, you're giving this to a small number of people. We're really just looking at safety and dosage, as well as to make sure that it stimulates the immune system. But the goal in these trials is not to determine if it works or not. It's really just looking to make sure that there are no serious adverse events. And again, this is a small number of people, could be anywhere from 20 to 100 individuals. They take this data, again, they take it back to the FDA. The FDA reviews all the phase 1 safety data. And if it meets criteria, then it can go into a phase 2 expanded trial where it goes up to hundreds of people. Now, a lot of the times they can combine phase 1 and phase 2. Essentially, they'll start with that 20 to 100 people for the safety, and then begin to enroll others into a phase 2 expanded trial. So it's kind of this rolling trial, if you will. In phase 2, they might be looking more at subgroups of their population. So children and elderly, different ethnicities, as well as looking further at if the vaccine has safety and can stimulate the immune system. Again, if it meets those criteria for phase 1 and phase 2, then the FDA will give them permission to move into phase 3. Phase 3 is really the turning point for any new drug. I've seen trials where you have a drug and you think it's awesome and it gets to phase 3, and then all of a sudden it's not efficacious, it's not significant. So this is when the scientists give it to thousands of people. So in the case of the COVID vaccine trial, they have trials of upwards 30,000 to 40,000 individuals. And in these cases, what they're really looking for is how many people became infected compared to those that just received a placebo, right? So half of your, in this trial, half of the patients are going to receive the vaccine, half are going to receive PBS or saline control. And it's double blind, so no one knows which ones you're getting except for the study coordinators. These trials are really going to determine if the vaccine protects against the virus. We can go on to the next slide now. Thank you. So if that meets all the specs, then regulators in the country, so in the United States, will review it according to their protocols and decide whether to approve it or not. So during the pandemic, and what we're seeing right now is they can be granted something called an emergency use authorization before a formal approval. And that's what's occurring with the vaccines we have now. Now they will continue to go on through a licensing process. But because we're in a pandemic right now, it's been granted this approval. Okay. And someone asked if the volunteers for the double-blind vaccine studies, including US members. I'm not sure about that. Next slide. So these are the vaccines. These are kind of the top 4 candidates. They're all in those phase 3 trials, well, except for Pfizer now, and to a certain extent Moderna. So Pfizer, we know, was first approved in the UK. It was approved in the United States. It was approved in the UK first because they have a little bit of a different process. They look at the data as it comes in, whereas our FDA kind of waits to get the data in batches. It's 95% efficacious at preventing the virus, and not a lot of side effects, some fatigue and headache, no severe adverse events. Now, you might have heard that there were a couple cases of some allergies. This vaccine is now being given with an advice or a guidance that if you are someone that has, carries an EpiPen or you've had severe allergic reactions in the past, this is something that you really need to speak with your clinician about for guidance on taking this particular vaccine. But it is an mRNA vaccine and it's 2 doses apart. 2 doses, 28 days apart. You do have to get both doses. So some people think they can get one and that's good. You really do need both doses. The next one, the FDA just this morning voiced that they would support approval for this vaccine. It's the Moderna vaccine. It's again 2 doses. So this one they say is 95 to 100% efficacious. So what they mean by that is it prevents disease 95% of the time. Those that did contract coronavirus, none of them progressed to significant disease. So in that sense, they say it was 100% efficacious. They've submitted their EUA. I think Thursday we'll see approval for this, and it'll probably be shipped out to the states next week. This one was associated with some more severe side effects, more fatigue and muscle pain. Generally, some people might kind of feel like garbage after they receive this vaccine. Tends to be after the 2nd dose. But I can guarantee you that these side effects are much less than having to suffer through COVID. So I would rather have a day of these side effects than having COVID. These side effects really just indicate that your immune system is working. You know, one of the things that happens when you generate an immune response is sometimes that's what makes us not feel good, right? So the fact that some people are having some of these symptoms is really just indicative that the vaccine is working in their body to confer protection. The other two, in light of time, I won't talk too much about, but there are two others, those adenoviral vector vaccines, 1 to 2 doses that also look very promising. I think we'll see them coming out more in the spring. So we could potentially have 4 vaccines in the arsenal. So this is just a graph to show the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine that is now out. So it was 52% after that first dose, but that jumps to 95% after that second dose, right? So after 14 days, that's when you really start to see protection in the vaccinated group compared to the unvaccinated group. And it's really after that second dose that you really see that efficacy at 95%. It doesn't differ by age, race, ethnicity. Next slide. So how is this being rolled out in Colorado? When do I get my vaccine? So this is the latest from CDPHE. You probably have heard about this on the news. So the first people that are getting it and who we're giving this vaccine to right now are those in direct contact with COVID patients. So your physicians, your respiratory therapists, your nurses, your cleaning staff on those COVID units, and also individuals at long-term care facilities. There's then going to be a 1B. This is going to be healthcare workers that are more at a moderate to high risk. So maybe they're a healthcare worker, but they're not in direct contact with COVID patients, EMS, firefighters, correctional workers, other COVID-19 response personnel. Spring is going to enter phase 2, and this is when we're going to see more of the general public receiving the vaccine. So these are going to be higher risk individuals and essential workers. So anyone 65 and older, people of any age with a comorbidity such as obesity, chronic lung disease, heart disease, or immunocompromised. So for example, they could be HIV positive, or they could be on a chemotherapy due to cancer. People who interact directly with the public at work. So these are going to include all of those essential employees like grocery store workers. I was also really pleased to see school and school staff is now in this phase 2 as well. And other phase 1 workers not covered. And then in the summer, we're going to begin to see this really roll out to the general public, probably through your local pharmacy. Anyone age 18 to 64 without any high risk conditions. So next slide. So this is back to Amy. And any questions, please continue to type them into the chat or email me. And I will answer the chat questions in the chat, Amy, if you want to.
Sure, I've been doing the chat while you're talking. I was tag teaming. Yeah, so that was our overview. If you guys have questions, we're happy to answer them. I'm also going to show you a slide here that will give you resources where you can find, actually, one of the resources is called All of the COVID-19 Vaccine Questions You Will Ever Have. So it's page after page of frequently asked questions. So we'll point you in that direction here in just a second. But take home messages we want you to kind of go away with from this presentation is to know that vaccines work with the immune system, and they're protecting us from disease and providing long-lasting protection that includes the creation of those memory cells that will live in our body for months and years to come. You learned about a lot of different types of vaccines that are under development right now against SARS-CoV-2. Some of them have come out more quickly than others, but there will likely be more that are going to get approval down the road. We know that vaccines undergo several phases of testing to ensure safety and efficacy before they're distributed to the general public, so beyond clinical trials. And that we talked to you a little bit about vaccine distribution in Colorado and how we're following a phased plan that was developed by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the CDPHE. So those are the things we hope you kind of take away. With that, we'll take questions, and here are our emails, so you can write those down if you'd like. And then the next slide I have for you are a variety of resources that really do a very comprehensive job of answering just about any question you would have about vaccines or the COVID-19 vaccine. So I'm going to go to that slide right now, just so you can have this. These are active links, so I don't know. I think you're going to get a recorded version of this sent to you. I think it was Roger, Santa number 1, who said that he would send this to everybody. So you can probably either take a picture of the screen or write these down, but these are going to have give you answers to all these different questions. So we did answer some in chat, but are there any additional questions that people have for us right now while we're here that we can try to answer for you?
And guys, I just want to let you know that you are all on mute. So if you want to talk, unmute yourselves.
I wanted to add one thing too. There's 2 things that I hear a lot about concerns of these vaccines, and please speak up or put it in the chat. One of the things I hear is that they were developed so quickly. And there are a lot of people that are concerned about how quickly these vaccines were developed. And I think part of this is, developing any type of a therapeutic, and this includes vaccines, is very, very expensive. And in the development of these vaccines, really money was made to be no object. The government put a lot of money into the development of these vaccines. And so they did not have to, raise funds and wait for investor funding or board approval to get more money for the continued production and enrolling people in the clinical trials. So I think that's one of the main reasons that this, was able to proceed so quickly. Another one is that it was really, really easy to get people enrolled in these particular trials because they just had a lot of people that were willing to roll up their sleeve and be in these vaccine trials. I know I know some others were as well. And the other thing is, some people are very concerned that if it's an RNA vaccine, that somehow that will go back and become part of your DNA. So I tried to explain why that absolutely cannot happen. RNA doesn't go back into the nucleus and doesn't become DNA. So the value of the Colorado exposure notification system. I think you might be talking about the app that you could use on your phone. Is that right, Pat? So I think part of that is just being able to track exposures to be able to prevent future outbreaks more readily than otherwise. So really, even though we have vaccines coming, we still really are encouraging people to continue to get tested, especially if they feel like they have been exposed, to make sure that we have a very accurate understanding of how the disease is still moving through the community.
Let me answer that cold
if
temperature.
Go ahead, Dad.
Where will they be administered for the most part?
So do you mean where you can go and get one?
Yes, exactly.
So that is, for the most part, they will be coming, I believe, out of the community pharmacy. Okay. So the way the rollout is working right now is the state got in an allotment of vaccines. Those were shipped out to specific locations, namely the hospitals. Some pharmacies got some because they're the ones that will be going to some of the resident facilities to administer those vaccines. The second rollouts that will be coming, there will probably be specific sites where you may go to receive this vaccine. Now, it could be a community pharmacy. It could be more of a drive-through situation where you drive through, sort of like you've seen the testing sites. You might drive through that to receive your vaccine. And a lot of that's going to be under the guidance of your own local public health department. And then in the spring, when they become widely available to everyone, those are probably going to be coming out through public health departments, doctors' offices, and community pharmacies.
There's
Does that
two
answer your
questions
question?
I have, if I can put in here a minute. There's so much fake news, that we read. We never know anymore what is fake and what's true. But was this truly the fastest development of a vaccine ever, number one? And number two, will the development of future vaccines be on a fast track because of what we learned about COVID?
Amy, you can chime in. I believe it is the fastest we've ever gone from preclinical to an EUA on a vaccine. The reason that this one was so fast is because of the pandemic. So I don't think this is not going to become a normal way for any drug, let alone a vaccine, to go through development.
The other thing we have to keep in mind is these mRNA vaccines, even though we don't have any that are currently licensed, this type of technology has been under development for at least 17 years. And it's not new in the sense that scientists have been working on this for a while. In fact, when the original SARS and then the following MERS epidemics happened, this type of vaccine was in the thought process and starting development, but then those epidemics resolved and did not become pandemics. So they did not go on to full-blown clinical trials like we're seeing for these. So it's new to us in the sense we don't have any license like this, but it's not necessarily new technology, if that helps.
I commented on the spacing between the flu vaccines because I was in the Pfizer trial, and so it was around the time I'd be getting my flu vaccine. They did ask me to space it out by about 2 weeks.
Okay.
But the main reason for that was actually, if you have any adverse event towards vaccination, it's really going to be really in the immediate and first few days, but they wanted to make sure that any adverse event was related to the COVID vaccine and not the flu shot.
Makes sense.
Okay. And as far as the cold temperatures, I know people have asked about that. mRNA, which is the formulation that Moderna and also the Pfizer BioNTech are using right now, mRNA is actually very unstable and degrades really quickly, even in our cells. So it has to be kept at very cold temperatures to make sure that it maintains its integrity and will actually work once it's injected into our body. So that's why the super cold temps are needed, is that mRNA is very unstable, just to make sure it remains intact and useful.
I have another question, if I may.
Sure.
Will we need to take the vaccine yearly as we do with flu? Or is it one that will last for 5 years, 10 years, something like that?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And if you could answer it, you would be a billionaire.
We really don't know. We know right now that it does provide immunity, but we don't know how long that immunity lasts. And so it could be something that you end up having to see it's taken as a yearly vaccine, like with influenza. But right now, we just don't have that. They don't have enough information on that. And if you think about, we're only a year into this disease in the United States. So that is data that we're just still working on. And I know as part of the vaccine trial, I'm going back for the next 2 years, every few months, to donate blood to see if I still have immunity to the virus through the vaccine.
Yeah, the thing is, we don't have enough time right now to know exactly how long. Like, we do know that people that have had it, that are in these clinical trials, we know that their immunity seems to be quite high and long lasting 3 months out. But, we'll know more as time goes by, which I know for all of us is not, the perfect answer, but we just need to follow the data and see how long protection lasts. But right now at 3 months, from what I've read, it looks like it is still quite high, which is a good sign. But how long that will last, we're not, like Dr. James said, we don't know. We need a little bit more time and more data.
Do we have conclusive evidence that this started in China?
I think that that it's been documented it's coming from Wuhan, China.
Thank you.
Do
It's
we
not-
know the exact source? I think we have evidence suggesting sources. What do you
Yeah.
think, Dr. James?
The suggested source is that it's a bat, and that it probably has its origin in a bat like other coronaviruses. Either way, it is considered zoonotic, which means that it basically was in an animal and then crossed over into the human population. And I've seen a lot of those happen in China and other, Middle Eastern countries. And it has in part to do with, population and environment, and those types of things. But we're confident that it came out of China, somewhere near, if not within Wuhan, probably came from an animal and spilled over into humans. So a lot of the question now, and there's interesting research coming out of CSU, where can you take this virus now and put it into another animal here that it can basically become a reservoir now in the United States. So what I mean by that is, if, for example, your deer mouse population gets infected with the coronavirus, can it just serve as a reservoir of this virus and then come back into people, similarly to the way hantavirus does? And that's, I know, what some people are looking at now.
What's the
Yeah.
story about minks?
I believe they think minks were kind of an intermediate reservoir. So they're not the primary reservoir, but they can kind of serve as a go-between, was my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're capable of becoming infected, and they were worried that might cause a crossover event into humans. So that's why I think they got rid of a bunch of minks
Right.
They did.
somewhere, like in Norway or something.
Denmark and
Denmark.
Oregon is being affected.
Yeah.
Well, guys, anybody have any other questions? You have the opportunity to email them.
Mhm.
We really have exceeded our time today, which is great, because I'm glad that we had this opportunity to hear about these developments on the vaccine, which I think is so very important. I am a pro-vaxxer, so yay, I know. And I'm glad you guys explained something to me that I am so glad to know why I got so sick after I had the flu vaccine. I don't get sick every time I have a vaccine, but now I know why. So it was great to understand that it's actually starting to work right away. So that was really nice. So with
I
you,
have another one, if I may.
go ahead, Bill. One question.
Would it make sense to have one from Pfizer and then a few months later to have one from Moderna?
No, actually, that's not recommended. There's slightly different formulations. And also we have to be very careful, because they are 2-dose series, and the vaccines, are kind of slow, they're quickly being rolled out, but we need to make careful that you don't get one Pfizer and then one Moderna, because they're really being allocated so that each individual has 2 of those vaccines reserved for them. So it's kind of a logistical issue as well. But we want to make sure that that second dose is really boosting the effect of the first dose. And the best way to do that is with the same formulation. I don't know if Amy, you want to comment on that as well.
Nice.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you, thank you, thank
I
you.
agree.
So, I want to thank you guys
Thank you.
for presenting. We do not give out speakers gifts at the Rotary Club of Lakewood Foothills, but we do, and you'll be liking this one, we do donate towards the End Polio Now campaign, which is our vaccination program throughout the world. There are only 2 endemic countries, which are Pakistan and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, COVID has put kind of a stop on vaccinations for a while up there, but those protocols have been used with the COVID vaccinations. And so I'm kind of excited, as well as the Ebola vaccinations. So I want to thank you. Those donations will actually be matched by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with an additional $2. So it's a $3 donation plus, of course, towards the End Polio Now campaign. So thank you so very much for being part of our meeting today. I'm very excited that you guys were part of our lives in this moment. So with that said, I'd like to say thank you to everybody from our club. Thank you to our guests for being part of our meeting today.